Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Dearlove, Deputy Director here at Clean Lakes Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you to the July edition of our Clean Lakes 101 Science Cafe, featuring the topic of cyanobacteria. Although we're continuing with the virtual Science Cafe format for now, we look forward to soon returning to an in-person format at the Edgewater on Lake Mendota. So we'll let you know when that transition occurs. I'd like to kick off this morning's event by first recognizing the generosity of our sponsors. They include our presenting sponsors, the First Weber Foundation and Johnson Financial Group, supporting sponsor, National Guardian Life Insurance Company, our normal hosting sponsor, the Edgewater, and our production partners, UW-Madison's Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the UW Division of Extension. Thank you, sponsors. Just a few quick announcements before we get started. First, a heartfelt thank you to everybody who participated in last month's Loop the Lake. I'm pleased to announce that we had over 1,100 riders, a new record for us, that joined us either in person at Olbrich Park on Lake Monona or virtually the week leading up to the event. And in all, you helped us raise over, and get this, $67,000 for lake improvement projects, educational programs like this one, and for our lake forecast monitoring initiative that reports water quality conditions at over 70 points around all 5 lakes. And if you haven't yet added that free lake forecast app to your smartphone, it's now available in the app and Android app store. So I encourage you to put that app on your phone. Second, I want to thank our most recent donors. And when I talk about our donors, they include our Friends of Clean Lakes, or our individual donors, our lake partners that represent businesses and organizations. And the most recent list of lake partners is showing on your screen. And if you haven't renewed or joined, we'd love to have your support, so please do so. You could just visit cleanlakesalliance.org/donate for more information. And while you're on our website, be sure to also visit our Yahara Clean page to take the Greater Madison Lake Survey. Your input will help inform our 19-member coalition of community partners that's developing an updated cleanup plan for our lakes. So without further ado, I'd like to I'm going to transition off to the next speaker who will tell us a little bit more about today's talk and the speaker lineup, and that's Kyle George from Johnson Financial Group. So Kyle, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. And just a quick housekeeping item. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So please feel free to submit questions via the chat function for our Zoom call today. So Johnson Financial Group is proud to support these talks, along with a variety of other Clean Lakes Alliance events and programs. Since 1970, Johnson Financial Group and its employees have dedicated ourselves to the communities where we live and work. Through progressive investments, philanthropic contributions, and the volunteer service of our employees, we actively work to improve people's lives and build thriving communities. Personally, it's been a pleasure to be involved in several of the Clean Lakes Alliance events, including the Loop the Lake bike events and golf outings. And in that spirit, I'm excited to introduce our topic for today. And as it turns out, it's very timely. Today's talk, titled Harmful Cyanobacteria in Our Waters, we've experienced it already a number of times this summer. Otherwise known as blue-green algae, has been a function of closing our beaches and lake access points. Native to every lake and river in Wisconsin, Cyanobacteria excessive growth has major impacts on public health, lake accessibility, and the ecosystem as a whole. Cyanobacterial blooms are driven by nutrient pollution, usually through stormwater runoff, high temperatures, and low wind. Presenting on today's topic is Gina LaLiberty, who leads response and communication on harmful algal bloom issues as the statewide harmful algal blooms coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She's worked on cyanobacteria, diatoms, and other algae for the DNR for the past 21 years. She holds a BS, Bachelor of Science in Biology, and a master's degree in Resource Ecology Management from the University of Michigan. Please welcome Gina LaLiberty.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to join you today. I think my screen should be showing now. So I'm going to be talking about harmful cyanobacterial blooms in our waters in the Yahara Lakes chain and in Wisconsin. And before I start, I am going to introduce some of the terms that I'm going to be using throughout this. So I do use these words interchangeably in this presentation. I'm going to be talking about blue-green algae, which are also known by the scientific term cyanobacteria. And these are actually true bacteria. Here you've got pictures. In these two pictures, we've got some photographs through the microscope of cyanobacteria. Here's a true algae, Spirogyra. So these are actually true bacteria. So they don't have internal organs and a nucleus like you would see in this true alga, Spirogyra. Now, cyanobacteria live in all aquatic systems, and there are actually some species that live on land as well. Planktonic cyanobacteria are buoyant. These dark bodies that you see in these cells are sort of these sort of gas bodies that they use for regulating their buoyancy in aquatic systems. And some bacteria, cyanobacteria, also have the ability to fix nitrogen, just like some plants such as alfalfa do through bacteria and nodules in their roots. So they're able to fix atmospheric nitrogen into a form that's usable by themselves and other algae using these specialized cells that you see right here. Now, the reason we're very concerned about cyanobacteria is that some are able to make toxins that can make people and animals sick if they ingest them. But it's really important to remember that not all cyanobacteria have this ability to make toxins, and even those that do don't make those toxins all of the time. So that previous slide showed photographs of what cyanobacteria look like under the microscope. Now, most people aren't like me and they don't have a little pocket microscope that they can take with them to the lake. So for most people, what you are going to be relying on to protect yourself and your family from cyanobacteria is learning what they look like in lakes where they're growing. So here we have a picture of some lake water sort of close up. You see a lot of these little green specks in the water, and these are actually cyanobacterial colonies. So these are planktonic cyanobacteria that grow floating in lake water. And so how can you just aside from looking at little green flecks floating in the lake, how can you really tell if you're looking at these planktonic cyanobacteria in the lake? There are some simple tests that you can do at home. So in addition to looking for these tiny green specks in the water, sort of what looks like a mint green dust on the surface, which are cyanobacteria and blue-green algae, you can do what's called the jar test. This is really simple. You just take a jar, scoop up some green lake water that contains these green particles, shake it up and wait. Most true algae will normally sink to the bottom of the jar. Planktonic cyanobacteria, if the jar sits undisturbed for an hour or so, will kind of form this floating green layer. So those planktonic cyanobacteria float, just letting them sit undisturbed in that jar allows them to float and make a layer. And again, those true algae usually sink. Now, this works for most situations for planktonic cyanobacteria. However, it's not absolutely foolproof and doesn't give you a good idea if all cyanobacteria that could possibly be in that lake water are addressed this way. It's just those planktonic cyanobacteria are the ones that are going to be floating. It's important to keep in mind, I mean, you may be alarmed if you have relatively clear lake water and you still see this floating green line. There's always going to be at least some cyanobacteria in all water bodies. This test isn't really a case of, is it a positive for cyanobacteria or negative? They are going to be there in at least very small quantities. But the really important question is, how much is there? And we'll go into that a little bit later of how to determine what the most hazardous conditions are. So this is the jar test. But you really have to look closely at those floating green layers because there are some small aquatic plants that are able to form those floating green layers as well. So here again, we have that photograph of that jar from the previous slide. Here's a picture of another green layer in a different jar of water. You really have to look closely at it to determine what it is, because there can be small green plants that float and make this green layer as well. So here we have a photograph looking through the side of the jar. You can see this is a duckweed plant with the root hanging down. So this is a close-up of what they look like. They're pretty small, but you can always see little green roots hanging off duckweed. There are also a lot of small watermeal plants in here. Watermeal is actually the smallest flowering plant in the world. So here's what it looks like from the side. Here's looking down into the jar. And watermeal plants usually have this very regular oval outline. They can feel kind of grainy if you rub them between your fingers. And they're really small. They're about half to a third of the size of a sesame seed. But again, they've got this very regular oval outline. They float. Quite often you see them mixed in with duckweed plants as well. So even if you get a floating green layer in a jar doing the jar test, make sure you look at it closely because it could be these floating plants as well. And these are pretty common. You can possibly have a mix of things, including these small floating plants and cyanobacteria, but the cyanobacteria are going to be much smaller usually than the watermeal plants. So do take a close look at what's in that jar. There are other things that can look like cyanobacteria that might form a floating layer in the jar as well, or might form floating layers on lakes. Pollen is one of those things, especially in late spring to early summer when pine trees are putting out a lot of pollen. You can have a lot of this kind of yellowish dust that shows up on the surface of lakes. So this is what pollen looks like. Sometimes it forms little blobs that float around on the surface, or it can form sort of scum lines on shoreline objects. But one of the things that can clue you into whether you're seeing pollen or cyanobacteria is to also look for similar yellow dust on land. So particularly on cars. Cars get really dusty with yellow pollen dusting them when pine trees are putting out a lot of pollen. So that's one way to check whether yellow stuff that you're seeing on the water is pollen or cyanobacteria. Now, quite often you see cyanobacteria or other kinds of algae forming floating mats. So how do you tell if floating mats in the lake are cyanobacteria or something else? You do what's called the stick test. You put a stick into the water that comes out covered with paint, or if it's little particles that just sort of fall apart, that's probably going to be cyanobacteria. If, however, you put a stick into the lake and lift it out and it looks like you have long green hair draping over it. So here is some stuff draping over some tweezers. Sometimes it can be really long like this. That's going to be filamentous green algae. So that's true algae. They're not harmful, but they can grow to very high levels. And we quite often see really high levels of filamentous green algae in the Yahara chain of lakes, especially in the spring. So there is one exception. So it does, again, pay to look closely at what's on the end of the stick. And that exception is a cyanobacterium called microscope. It's formerly called Ligbia. People who study cyanobacteria change the names all the time. So the current name of this one is microscope, and that has a very dark color. It looks sort of blackish to the naked eye. So here is microscope right next to filamentous green algae in a small petri dish. That's a penny for scale. You can see how small these filaments are, but those are actually really huge for cyanobacteria. These can grow to be several centimeters or inches long, which is just absolutely giant for something that's a bacterium. But again, look really closely at that color. Microscope is going to be sort of black in color like this, black to a very dark forest green. Filamentous green algae, especially when it's fresh and growing and happy, is going to have this lighter leaf green color. So that was the jar and the stick test. So those are some ways that you can just sort of get an idea of whether what you're seeing in the lake is cyanobacteria or something else. So I'm going to talk now about blooms. Blooms, whether they're cyanobacteria or other kinds of algae, are just simply excessive growth to what people normally would consider nuisance levels. I'm going to use some acronyms in the rest of this talk. So when I talk about HABs, that's just a shortened way of saying harmful algal blooms. Now for blooms, there's no official quantification that actually exists for them. They're just sort of excessive growth to nuisance levels, but can be really difficult to define them sometimes, especially for cyanobacterial blooms, because they can be really patchy in time and space. You can have portions of one lake that's really impacted by a severe bloom, while other parts of the lake can have perfectly clear water. So blooms can be really localized, but sometimes, of course, you can have really lake-wide blooms as well. And blooms usually are a symptom of nutrient pollution. You can only get these really large or lake-wide blooms if you have a lot of nutrients present in that water that can support their growth. So blooms are not really a new problem in the Yahara Lakes. This is a paper that was written in 1889 by William Trelease, who worked in Madison, and he talks in this paper about blooms in 1882 in both Lake Mendota and Lake Monona. So this probably sounds familiar to what we experience these days in the Madison chain of lakes. He writes, every season, a greenish yellow scum occurs in greater or less quantity on third and fourth lakes, Mendota and Monona, during the hot weather of summer, after the water has been calm for a number of days in succession. So he really nails in that sentence the times when we tend to see blooms happening on our lakes during hot weather and following a period of calm weather. So these blooms have been an issue for a while. Back in the 1800s, the blooms were getting a lot of nutrients because we were dumping sewage and different industrial waste directly into the lakes, adding a lot of nutrients to the lakes. So that, of course, has changed. We can't dump sewage into the lakes anymore. We have septic systems and sewage systems, but some of those nutrients are possibly still in the sediments of the lakes today. So we've got legacy nutrients that can still be impacting us these days. So I'm going to show you some photographs of what different kinds of blooms look like. I'm going to start with the planktonic blooms. So again, those blooms that are comprised of cyanobacteria that are floating in the water column. And planktonic blooms are really what we're most concerned about regarding exposure of both people and animals to the toxins that some blue-green algae can produce, because they can be really diffuse through the water column, and they can be especially concentrated right along the edges of lakes where people and animals are most likely to be exposed to them. And again, lake-wide or large planktonic blooms tend to occur in lakes with high nutrients. So here you see a lot of really green water in this picture, and sometimes, especially if you've got wind blowing or it's just a really, really heavy bloom, you can have what we call these pea soup conditions. You can see how dark green and opaque that water looks. There are just trillions and trillions of tiny little particles in there. And if you were to step into that water, you probably wouldn't be able to, even if you were only ankle deep in that, you probably wouldn't be able to see your toes. So these are the pea soup conditions of this planktonic bloom. And this represents really high concentrations of cyanobacteria in this water. You can often see planktonic scums forming, especially when you have calm weather. So blue-green algae float if you don't have a lot of wind and waves mixing them into the water. That allows them to float to the surface and form scums. You'll notice in all of these photographs that the water is very calm. You don't see any waves in these pictures, which allows the scums to float to the surface. You also see from left to right sort of gradient from this actively growing cyanobacterial bloom that's sort of this dull green color to having some more colors mixed in there as this bloom starts to decompose. And then as the blooms really start to decompose then and the cells break open, that's when you can start to see some of these really vivid colors. So we've got actively growing bloom here, sort of this dull green, down to when you start to see more vivid colors as the blooms decompose. And I'll talk a little bit more about colors in a minute. You can also have really localized bloom conditions that are driven by wind, especially if you have a calm period that allows scums to form, and then that's followed by a period of gentle wind blowing across a lake in one direction for a while. So here you've got a satellite photograph of what this looks like from space. It's very highly enhanced photographs showing blooms in Lake Mendota and Lake Monona. And you can tell that the wind is blowing from the southwest because you've got that bloom accumulated here, the northeast portion of Lake Monona. And that's what this can look like. While this upwind area can have completely clear water. So these photographs were taken on Lake Monona about an hour apart, about 3 miles apart. You've got pea soup conditions in one area, perfectly great swimming conditions in another area. So something like this can make it really difficult to monitor and communicate conditions to the public, because you can have pretty bad bloom conditions in one part of the lake, especially on large lakes. You can have a large part of the shoreline in the rest lake can be have really good swimming conditions. So it's really important if you're going out to the lake to pay attention to wind level. If you find wind direction rather. So if you find the place you're going to go swim has a lot of algae in the water that looks like this, go towards the upwind side of the lake, and then you might end up with better swimming conditions. I also want to point out that wind can create blooms that these really localized blooms, even if lakes have really low nutrient levels. People can be really concerned if the lake has excellent water quality, that they see a bloom, but quite often it's the circumstance that you have a period of calm weather, the very small amount of cyanobacteria in a lake float to the surface, and then they're concentrated at the downwind shore by wind. So pay attention to wind direction. It can really influence where blooms occur. And these aren't technically a blooms, but I'm including it in here because they do represent some high concentrations of cyanobacteria. There are a lot of cyanobacteria that grow on the bottoms of lakes and ponds and rivers. And sometimes these will get dislodged either by physical disturbance or just through photosynthesizing a lot. They put out a lot of oxygen. If that bubbles up within their mats, it can lift them to the surface. And you can get these floating mats that have come up from the lake bottom. So here are some sort of fuzzy looking mats that have come up. Here are some that are starting to decompose and show some purple pigment. This is amidst a sea of duckweed in this very very undisturbed area. Sometimes they can have really vivid colors and be quite large. And sometimes they can have kind of brownish colors. But in general, if you see kind of these weirdly colored floating mats, those can quite often be cyanobacteria in lakes as well. All right, so those were some of the blooms and forms. And I talked a little bit about colors. You can really see a lot of different colors in blooms, especially as they start to decompose. So again, to remind you, this portion in the upper left photograph, the green part is actively growing cyanobacteria. And here you've got some purple showing as those blooms start to break down. So there are some cyanobacteria that have sort of reddish and purple pigments that you can see when they're growing or breaking down. These central photographs show more typical colors, the gradient from sort of blue to green. But there are some cyanobacteria that can be sort of a tan color as they're growing actively, or sometimes a very whitish color too as they start to decompose. So really, anytime you see really vividly colored water, it's a good idea to try to stay clear of it, look for clear conditions, because most often these vividly colored growths in fresh water are going to be cyanobacteria. So I'm going to talk now about some of the causes of harmful algal blooms. So in general, excess nutrients in a water body are going to be fuel for growth. Phosphorus is really important, but nitrogen is important too. It does support growth, and we're concerned about nitrogen because there is increasing evidence that nitrogen can influence the toxicity of blooms, because there are a number of cyanobacterial toxins that require nitrogen as in order to build those molecules. So excess nutrients are the main cause, and we see the most problems with blooms in eutrophic or hypereutrophic lakes, so lakes with high nutrient levels or very high nutrient levels. We also typically see blooms in the summer to early fall. That's when water temperatures are at their warmest. Cyanobacteria are actually better adapted to grow in warm water that can actually inhibit the growth of other more desirable kinds of algae in a lake. And calm weather is, as I discussed previously, that's also something that can promote scum formation and blooms. In Wisconsin, it seems to be that water bodies that are shallow reservoirs or impoundments on rivers can be really particularly vulnerable to blooms. So if you think about it, you have a shallow water body that can possibly warm up faster and stay warmer longer. So that's something that can promote the growth of cyanobacteria. And also, if you put a dam on a river system and you get an impoundment, you're essentially slowing down that flow that would normally help to flush nutrients out of that water body. So reservoirs and impoundments tend to have a lot of problems. However, it's important to recognize the exact causes that result in blooms can be really complex and very specific to a water body. So things like the lake type. Is it a drainage lake or a seepage lake that doesn't have any inlets and outlets to it? How deep is that lake? What's the level of legacy nutrients in the sediments in that lake? What species are involved in those blooms? And there can be other biological interactions as well, I'll talk about in a minute. So blooms can happen in any water body, but they can be really localized. And that can be the case even in lakes that have excellent water bodies, as I discussed previously, talking about those wind-driven blooms. So what are we doing in Wisconsin to prevent harmful algal blooms from occurring? The best tool that we have are nutrient reduction efforts. So once nutrients like phosphorus get into a lake, they can be really difficult to remove. So this is a case where preventing nutrients to come into a lake, either through point sources or non-point sources, is really the best tool that we have. There are a lot of harmful algal bloom mitigation strategies that are out there that really address the symptom, harmful algal blooms, rather than the direct cause, which are the nutrients. And for our nutrient strategy in Wisconsin, we do have a link to the DNR's surface water nutrient strategy here. You can go to the DNR's website and just search for the term nutrient strategy. But it's not just the DNR working this. So the efforts for point source regulation and non-point best management practices, or BMPs, to slow the flow of nutrients into lakes and rivers are really implemented through cooperation of a lot of different stakeholders. That includes municipalities, land and watershed groups such as Clean Lakes Alliance, counties, University of Wisconsin Extension, agricultural producers, and state and federal agencies. And it's, unfortunately, nutrient reduction efforts aren't a quick fix. It's not something where you start implementing best management practices and expect to see instant results. It can take a long time, unfortunately, to produce results, because in many cases it's taken a long time to get those nutrients into the lakes to begin with. So there are things that individuals can do to help in this effort. It's really important to decrease your input of runoff and nutrients into lakes. So Healthy Lakes Wisconsin program at healthylakeswi.com has some great strategies that lake homeowners can do to to install different methods for reducing runoff from their property. And it also has some great side benefits to you, such as increasing the natural beauty of your property and privacy, in addition to decreasing runoff. If you have a property on a lake and you're on a septic system, it's very important to inspect and maintain that septic system, because septic systems can be an important source of nutrients if they are leaky and adding nutrients to lakes. It's also important to manage aquatic plants responsibly. They're really going to be your friend in the fight against algae blooms, because aquatic plants take up nutrients, incorporate them into their tissues, and then those nutrients are then not available for cyanobacteria to take up later. And it's also important to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. I'll talk about that in a minute. And especially in the Yahara chain of lakes, it's important to keep leaves and yard waste out of the streets, not just in the fall, but all year round. So not blowing grass clippings, for example, into the streets in the summer, because leaves, grass clippings, and other yard debris can be sources of nutrients to the water as well when they wash into the lakes via storm sewers. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. So those are some of the strategies that we have for addressing blooms and trying to reduce their occurrence. But unfortunately, climate change in Wisconsin has been complicating harmful algal bloom prevention. So here I have a couple of charts from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, and they demonstrate that we are already seeing climate change impacts in Wisconsin. So both of these divide the state into different regions. If there's a star within that region, it means there's a statistically significant trend. So this graph figure on the left shows the historic change in the annual mean or annual average temperature from 1950 to 2018. So these are changes that have already taken place. And this figure shows that Wisconsin is becoming warmer on average, the entire state. This figure shows the change in annual precipitation in the state of Wisconsin. There is a trend towards more annual precipitation in the north, and significant trend towards annual precipitation increasing in the southern part of the state as well. So Wisconsin's becoming warmer and wetter, and that's something that's going to, unfortunately, possibly promote blooms into the future. They like those warmer water conditions, and you've got wetter conditions, so more precipitation that can bring more nutrients into water bodies via runoff. Here, this figure is from the U.S. Global Change Research Program. One of the reasons for that is in the Great Lakes states, the upper Midwest, we are seeing a 42% increase in the heaviest single day events in the past 30 years. So in 1986 to 2016 versus a reference period of 1901 to 1985. And we have experienced that here in recent years. If you think about how many rain events that we have during the summer that are 1, 2, even 3 inches, that's part of what's driving this 42% increase in those heavy single day events. And those can be really significant sources of nutrients via runoff into lakes. Additional things that is complicating HAP prevention that's related to climate change is the shorter ice duration and longer growing season that we're seeing in Wisconsin. So this is from the Wisconsin State Climatology Office. This is the ice duration record for Lake Mendota. We've got great records going back into the 1860s, and there is a significant decrease in the length of ice on period in the lakes. So we're getting longer growing seasons, and that can allow blooms to really get a jump start early in the spring and persist into autumn, and really helps them to persist. They don't really, if there's a shorter period of ice cover in the winter, they don't really die off as much. And we saw this in last year. So we had blooms occurring in the Madison area into November and December in Madison Lakes and in Devil's Lake as well. So unfortunately, cyanobacterial blooms are just another example of how climate change is really presenting challenges to us in Wisconsin. So get warmer water, more precipitation, this shorter ice duration and longer growing season. And unfortunately, that possibly is going to lead to more cyanobacteria in our lakes. Aquatic invasive species can also affect HAB formation. The Madison chain of lakes, we have now zebra mussels are established, as well as spiny water fleas, Bithytrophes. Both of these can complicate efforts to reduce harmful algal blooms as well. Zebra mussels can directly affect blooms. So they're filter feeders. They can take the more desirable algae out of the water column by filtering it. They spit out planktonic cyanobacteria, and then basically they're taking out cyanobacteria's competitors. Those cyanobacteria then can float back to the surface and form blooms. Spiny water fleas can indirectly affect HAB formation because they're predators. They eat some of the small zooplankton, such as Daphnia, that can eat cyanobacteria. So you take out those grazers that would normally eat cyanobacteria, you can possibly have more blooms as well. So unfortunately, both of these species, which have now been established in the Yahara chain of lakes, might lead to more cyanobacteria. We're still sort of early on, I guess, in those invasions. So we'll continue to watch those and see how that plays out. So I talked about what blooms are, how you can tell if green water is cyanobacteria, and talked about some of the impacts of nutrients and climate change. But what people are really interested in is, okay, well, given all that, how can I tell if the water is safe? Most people don't have microscopes that they take around with them to look at. You probably wouldn't take a jar to do a jar test at the beach. So really, to assess risky water conditions, you want to observe the conditions for yourself before you swim, and look for those highest risk conditions, and pick better places for swimming if you see really green water such as this. We're very fortunate in the Madison area that we've got great tools like the Lake Forecast app to get the Clean Lakes Alliance monitors data, observing the conditions on different parts of the lakes. We've got a great beach monitoring program through Public Health Madison-Dane County, but those results may be delayed a bit in how quickly they get to the internet for you to look at those results. And conditions can really change rapidly too. So it's always important to look at the conditions for yourself before you swim. And I'll go into some of that in a little bit more detail. So how public health agencies quantify risk is through doing a lot of beach monitoring and toxin testing. These are some of the guidelines that they're able to use now. A few years ago, the US EPA established some recreational advisory levels for two types of cyanobacterial toxins. So microcystins, which are the most commonly occurring cyanobacterial toxins in Wisconsin, and cylindrospermopsin. There are other kinds of cyanotoxins. Unfortunately, the EPA did not have enough data to establish guidelines for those. And Public Health Madison-Dane County uses this 8 microgram per liter swimming advisory level or recreational advisory level. The EPA based this on the effects on target organisms, and they set these guidelines to be protective of children. So children, because they've got a small body size, they tend to swallow more water when they're swimming. They have a higher risk than adults do. So these EPA guidelines are designed to be protective of children, but the EPA only set these guidelines for toxins. In the past, we've also had World Health Organization guidelines that were established in 1999 that were based on microcystin toxin or cell density of cyanobacteria. However, these guidelines were set based on the risk to adults. WHO set low, moderate, high, and very high risk levels of illness if an adult was to swallow lake water containing either this cell density of cyanobacteria or these concentrations of microcystin toxin. These have been slightly changed recently there were new guidelines issued by the WHO in 2021. So their guideline value for microcystin is now 24 micrograms per liter. And they also set guidelines for 3 other types of toxins. But one of the really useful things that I've taken away from this older WHO guidelines is that for adults, they were able to establish that high to very high risk for adults, if they're swimming in these concentrations of cyanobacteria or microcystin, roughly correlate to being not able to see your toes in knee-deep water. So if an adult wades into a lake, can't see her toes, that means the risk for her is high or very high if she's going to swim and swallow that water. Now, of course, that's set for adults. The risk would be much higher for smaller children. But anyway, that knee deep test is sort of a good rule of thumb that people can use. It's quick and easy. But really, the good thing about blooms in assessing risk for yourself is that you can see those blooms that are of highest concern. Anytime you have surface scums, such as this, or that pea soup water, that indicates that there's possibly going to be high toxin concentrations present if those toxins are being produced. I mean, cyanobacteria don't always produce toxins, but these are sort of a great visual warning sign to you that you want to choose a different place for water recreation. And water's never going to be 100% safe. There's always going to be other bacteria, viruses, and parasites that can be present in that water that you really don't want to swallow, because those things can make you ill as well. So for conditions where you have some of these large floating mats that you might be able to avoid, those are going to be more of judgment calls for you. You might be able to avoid it, but small children might be attracted to it to play with it, and dogs might intentionally snap at these in water. So take into account who's going to be recreating in the water and how well they would be able to keep themselves from encountering this. Another judgment call would be a really fine dust on the surface. That might depend on what your particular recreation is. Are you swimming through this? Might not be great, but it might be okay to wade if you're going to wash off immediately afterwards. So really, the good thing about cyanobacteria, if you want to think about it, is you can really see these hazardous conditions. One thing I want to point out, since we do have some significant issues with filamentous green algae accumulations in the Yahara Lakes, especially in the spring, is that filamentous green algae don't produce toxins. But anytime you get situations like this, where you've got a lot of decomposing mat material, or if you've got any other accumulation of decomposing organic material in the water, you can sometimes have excessive bacterial growth in that water. So you also want to avoid swimming through conditions especially like this on the right, just because you can have higher bacteria levels too. Those could make you sick if you were to swallow water containing that. So in general, the ways that you can stay safe are all really common sense measures. Avoid swimming in and boating through blue-green algal scums in that pea soup water. Use that knee-deep test as sort of as a gauge. Can you see your feet or your toes? If you can't, you really need to choose a better place to swim. And for small children and pets, it's important to choose the clearest water possible for them to swim. And very important to avoid swimming in shallow, warm, stagnant water bodies. There are some mats that might grow on the bottom in those stagnant areas that could make people sick if they were to dislodge them and accidentally swallow them. That can make animals sick as well. And you can have other parasites parasites and viruses and bacteria that like those conditions as well. So not great. Always shower after swimming in a lake, river, or pond. And it's always important to avoid swallowing water, no matter how clean it looks. This is true, especially after rainstorms, when you can have higher bacteria levels in lakes from all that material being washed into the lake after rainstorms. So really, if you're in doubt, keep out. That's the safest thing that you can do. Now, I do get questions a lot about what conditions are safer for dogs. It's, again, important to choose the clearest water possible for them to swim in non-stagnant areas. Assess how much stuff is in that water. And if you want a good gut check, think about whether you want that water that your dog is going to swim in your mouth. If you don't want that water in your mouth, then your dog shouldn't have it in his or her mouth either, and you should find a better place for your dog to swim. So here we sort of have a gradient of conditions. On the left, clean, clear water. There's a lot of exchange with the greater lake. This is okay for dogs. Here in the middle, it's more of a maybe situation. You can see that water is a little bit greenish. There are some small green particles in the water, but there's not a lot. So she'll be in there for a little while. She's going to be monitored to make sure she doesn't drink a lot of lake water, and she'll have some clean, cold water on shore to drink. And she's going to be washed off when she gets out of the water with some clean water, just to wash any cyanobacteria off her fur, so she doesn't ingest it while grooming herself after swimming. Here on the right, this is a definite no. You can see how green and pea soupy that water looks, and you can also see an accumulation of cyanobacteria on that beach as well. So this dog's not even going to hang out at the beach. She's going to go for a nice walk in the woods and avoid that green stuff. So really important to assess conditions for dogs because they can have a higher exposure than people. Situations that really are not recommended for swimming either for people or for pets include these shallow warm stagnant areas. You can have blue-green algae mats that can dislodge from the bottom, and we've actually had a couple of really serious illnesses in dogs after swimming in sort of stagnant conditions like this, when they were exposed to and ingested some of these mats that floated up from the bottom. And it's also important to avoid these areas that have a lot of organic stuff in them. You can have high bacteria levels. You could possibly have isolated pockets of blue-greens blue-greens or cyanobacteria that get trapped in here as well. So these are not recommended for swimming. And remember that even if there aren't any no swimming signs posted, don't assume it's necessarily going to be safe for you or for pets. So a lot of times people will let their dogs go in here. It's really not a great idea, especially bad idea if dogs are trying to go into stormwater retention ponds. You can get a lot of stuff washed in there with stormwater, including contaminants from roadways. Not a good idea for anybody. Couple other things I want to cover about keeping your pets safe. We've had several dog deaths due to water intoxication and heat stroke in Wisconsin, and these share symptoms with cyanotoxin poisoning and were initially blamed on exposure to cyanobacteria, but after veterinary analysis concluded that these dog deaths unfortunately were due to water intoxication. So water intoxication happens when dogs ingest a lot of water, either if they're swimming or retrieving, or in some cases just sort of playing games like snapping at water that's splashed at them. They take in too much water too fast, and it can cause things like seizures and death, unfortunately. So it's important to give your dog frequent breaks from playing in the water. If they are retrieving, use flat objects for them to retrieve, which will help to minimize the amount of water that they ingest. Regarding heat stroke, dogs don't thermoregulate as well in the summer, so make sure they have ways to stay cool, give them access to shade, and always give them access to clean drinking water. If it's a really hot day, you might want to consider leaving your dog at home just so they don't overheat. One other thing to keep in mind is if your dogs or your cats eat grass and you live on a lake and you use lake water to irrigate your lawn, don't do that during a bloom, because you're essentially taking that bloom material and transferring it up onto your lawn where your pets can eat it. So just some other things to keep in mind regarding pets and cyanobacteria. So finally, if you need more information about blue-green algae, please see the DNR's website, dnr.wi.gov. Search for the word algae, which will get you to our blue-green algae page. You can report blooms. There is an email address, dnrhabs@wisconsin.gov, that I'd like like to invite people to use to report significant blooms. What really helps is to get the location, the name of the water body, the nearest town and county, the size and duration of the bloom. And what is really useful for me for verification purposes is photographs, both close up and overall, that I can use to verify whether that's a bloom, and in some cases, what type of cyanobacteria. I will say that the Yahara chain is really well covered, both with the Public Health Madison-Dane County beach alerts and through the Lake Forecast app. So I do know when blooms are happening on the Yahara chain, and through some satellite products that are available from the US EPA as well. But if you're on other water bodies and you notice a bloom, please report those to DNR HABs at wisconsin.gov. And then that's my my email if you need to contact me, or use DNR HABs as well. That will come to me as well. So that's all I have. And I think we've got time for questions now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and thanks everybody for your attention.
Well, thanks, Gina. Fantastic presentation. And as I assumed, we have a large amount of questions, and I'm going to try to get to as many of them as we can here in the next 10 minutes. I'm going to try to combine a few. Somebody asked, how warm does a lake have to be to have the harmful algal bloom? And then maybe how long does it typically last? And I know these are a little more...
That's a good question. And
but...
unfortunately, with a lot of scientific things, the accurate answer is it depends. There are actually some cyanobacteria that can grow under ice in the winter, so they're really cold tolerant. I want to say that I think some of the numbers I've seen regarding water temperatures is when it gets into the 70s, like mid 70s. That's when cyanobacteria typically, they become happy, they grow better. And that's when other more desirable algae, so things like diatoms that are a really important part of the food web, and green algae, that's when they start to get heat stressed and they just don't grow as well. Regarding how long blooms last, that really depends a lot on weather. So we've got some areas on the lakes in Madison that have blooms. We've got big storms that are going to come through today, and that's probably going to break those up. What's going to really depend on whether the blooms reform is if those big storms are followed by kind of breezy days that keeps that water well mixed, or if we then get several days of low wind conditions, which can help scums to develop.
Great answer. Another interesting question I thought was wondering if there's a trend in harmful algal blooms. I mean, is there a local or regional, or even like a worldwide trend? Are we seeing any sort of trends in harmful algal blooms?
That's a great question. I've actually seen very, very different responses in the scientific literature. There's some groups that have looked at a lot of records that we have that have concluded, okay, we definitely have an upward trend of blooms globally for many reasons, a lot of them related to climate change. There have been some other sub-studies that have looked at regional effects, and they've concluded that, hey, looking at even things like satellite information that we've had since the 1980s, that there really isn't a big trend. But a lot of that depends on the scale that you're looking at. If you're looking at, okay, there's a bloom on part of the lake, therefore we're going to call the entire lake affected by the bloom, or if you're just looking at individual high concentrations as well. So personally, I think we've got an upward trend, and I certainly am getting a lot more reports compared to like 10 years ago working for the DNR, because people are a lot more aware of it now and they're concerned.
Yeah, I guess awareness is probably the best thing, but of all of it, is that we're all a little bit more aware of what we're looking for instead of just something on the lake. Another kind of couple interesting questions I want to combine. Somebody wondered, we see the county weed cutters out, weed harvesters, I guess, doing their work. Does the weed cutting decrease the blooms at all? And then someone kind of a similar question said, after it's cut, when some of the leftover stuff that's not collected washes up on shore, does that decomposition fuel the cyanobacteria at all? So are those county weed harvesters, is there anything that correlates that to cyanobacteria?
Well, I mean, if you think about what nutrients are locked up in that plant biomass, the weed harvesters taking those aquatic plants out of the lakes, that's one way to get some nutrients out of the lake. So they're not going to be available anymore for cyanobacteria. Regarding the plant debris that can wash up sometimes, I'm not sure what magnitude that is actually adding nutrients into the lake. I mean, if you consider that if those plants were growing naturally in the water body, they would still be in there. They're going to decompose on their own eventually. What I would be more concerned about if you have a lakeshore area with a lot of plant debris, those are conditions where you can see higher bacteria levels. The bacteria are growing amongst those plants.
Interesting question here about the effectiveness, in your opinion, of chemically treating lakes to kill cyanobacteria. So we've heard of maybe alum treatments of some smaller systems. You know, is that something that's an option on a larger lake like Mendota? You know, what are the downsides of using a chemical treatment like alum?
Yeah, well, chemical treatments like alum, and there are other products too, those act to basically bind phosphorus, and they make it chemically unavailable for uptake. So it's actually, instead of a direct algal bloom control, it's an indirect effect, because you're just taking away the phosphorus, you're making it inactive, keeping in the sediments, and algae can't take it up. There are other chemical treatments that are available, but DNR has to be very careful about permitting those in some cases, because we don't necessarily know what the effects are going to be on non-target species. We can't really permit something that's, say, going to wipe out all the other beneficial algae, because then you're wiping out the entire food web in a lake.
Sure.
And some of those chemical treatments can be very expensive to scale up on large scales.
How important is the cyanobacteria to the food web? I mean, that's a kind of a greater question too. I mean, this is somewhat of a natural process. So
It
how
is.
important is it to the food web?
Well, they are eaten by some things. So Daphnia can take them up really well, and there's Daphnia in all water bodies. They're not really as high a quality food source as other more beneficial kinds of algae. So
And then
things like diatoms are much better food source.
if you loaded with Daphnia, then is there a negative effect on you know? It seems like through time, whenever we try to play God and add something to the lake, there's usually a side effect. So if we were to say, great, let's just pump Daphnia into the Yahara watershed, is there a downside to that?
Well, no, well, I guess you'd have to carefully assess what all is in the food web and eating things, but Daphnia are grazers, and there have been different projects in Wisconsin that use what's called biomanipulation. You wouldn't necessarily be farming Daphnia on a large scale and then dump a tanker truck up to the lake and dump them. But instead, what you would do is you would control the things that are preying on them. So in other lakes, we've taken out, I think you can add predatory fishes, which then eat the planktivorous fishes that would normally eat the Daphnia, which means then you get more Daphnia, and then more Daphnia are eating more algae in the water. But at least in the Yahara chain, that's going to be complicated a little bit, because we have Bithotrephes, that spiny water flea, that's eating Daphnia, unfortunately. And while some fish can eat them, they're kind of hard to handle with that long spine. So they're not a preferred food item.
Sure. Sort of a kind of a combined couple questions here, sort of medical. Somebody asked, how long should you wait to get in the water after a confirmed bloom? And then sort of along the same lines, what type of symptoms would people experience if they were exposed to the toxins in a bloom?
Okay, well, I'll address that second question first. So if you're ingesting toxins in a bloom, normally in people, you would see things like GI distress, if people are, say, water skiing through a bloom and they're inhaling water droplets containing the toxins, sometimes people have sort of flu-like symptoms or allergy type symptoms. They can have eye irritation as well. And some people also seem to be susceptible to skin irritation. So if you have cyanobacteria rubbing on your body under clothing, such as under a bathing suit or wading sandals, you can have you can get rashes sometimes. So there's I think in the advertisement page for this talk there, I provided a link to the Wisconsin Department of Health Services website. So they have a lot of great health information about different symptoms, and they've got excellent fact sheets for both people and pets as well. So I would encourage people to look for those fact sheets.
Right.
So the question about how soon to get back in the water after a confirmed bloom. Again, unfortunately, I'm going to say it depends. Because conditions that lead to the dissipation of the bloom can really vary. If it's just being blown to a different part of the lake, or has it decomposed? If it's decomposed, then you could still possibly have some toxins present in the water.
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer.
It is. I guess, I mean, if you're that concerned, if you know that you or a family member has some health issues, then you really want to err on the side of caution and pick a different place where you know a bloom hasn't been
Sure.
present, or maybe choose something else to do that day that doesn't require you to put your head underwater, which puts you at risk from swallowing water.
Right.
So something like canoeing or boating might be okay.
We're at time here, and I want to be mindful of people's time. But there was one question I saw came in I wanted to ask. It was an interesting one. Someone was curious, and this is just maybe more of a yes or no. Is there any methods, just like, the weed harvesters harvest the weeds, is there a method like just vacuuming the surface that could help this, or is that just you're taking a bucket of rainwater out of the sky?
That's been proposed from different areas, and there's a lot of things you have to take into account. You don't want to physically disturb a bloom that's on the verge of decomposing, because then that can just break the cells open, and then bam, you've got a big slug of toxins possibly being released into the water. And the question is, then what do you do with that material? Let's say you've got something, you've drained it, and you have really high toxin levels in that material. What do you do with that? You can't necessarily go spread it on an agricultural field, because there's been some work out of the Ohio State University that shows that plants can take up microcystin toxins from the soil. So you have to be careful about what you do.
Yeah.
Think about the whole process.
Sure.
Not just get rid of it and then we'll deal with it later. You have to think it through.
Right. No, very, very good. And gosh, we are at time here, and we have so many more questions that unfortunately we're not going to get to. But I want to thank Gina Liberty again for such a really timely and informative presentation. We've all seen these cyanobacteria blooms, and the weather we've had this summer, we'll probably continue to see them. So good plug to download Lake Forecast on your phone. It's free in the Apple and Android app stores. Our volunteer monitors are checking 70 points around all 5 lakes, usually around twice a week. And kind of what Gina said, if you can go on there and see where there is a cyanobacteria bloom, and if you still want to use the lakes, our lakes are so dynamic. So maybe your planned visit to James Madison Park won't work, but you can go to Lake Farm County Park on Lake Wabisa. So Lake Forecast is just a great way to find out where the best water is on our lakes. Thanks again to our sponsors. Hope to see everybody back here on Wednesday, August 11th. We'll be hearing from Jessica Niekritz from Clean Fuel Partners, and we're going to learn all about manure digesters, which is really interesting. It's a really interesting process, and I'm sure Jessica's going to have some great pictures to show us. So thanks again for everybody for joining us this morning, and have a great Wednesday.
Thanks for having me.